Every city has its invisible people, those who move through crowded streets like ghosts, seen but not noticed, present but not acknowledged. They push shopping carts filled with what others call trash, and they call treasure. They sleep in doorways that empty at dawn. They carry burdens that most of us will never understand. In Providence, Rhode Island, one such invisible man had been pushing the same shopping cart through the same streets for 8 years. But what he carried wasn't trash. It was sacred. October 2019 arrived in Providence with that particular New England crispness. Air sharp enough to remind you that winter was coming, but gentle enough to make you grateful for the autumn you still had. In the municipal court, Judge Frank Caprio was working through his Tuesday morning docket with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd been doing this for 3 decades. At 78 years old, Judge Caprio had become something of an internet sensation. Videos of his compassionate rulings had been viewed millions of times worldwide. People traveled from other states just to witness his courtroom, hoping to see the legendary judge who treated every defendant with dignity, who looked past the charge to see the human being behind it. The morning had been typical. Parking violations, minor traffic infractions, the usual parade of small mistakes that bring people into contact with the legal system. Judge Caprio moved through each case with his characteristic blend of wisdom and warmth, dismissing some fines, reducing others, always looking for the story beneath the surface. At 10:30, the bailiff brought in the final case of the morning. Edward Patrick Sullivan, age 78. Charge, shoplifting. Specifically, 1 loaf of bread valued at $2.49. The man who shuffled through the courtroom doors moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had become an adversary. He used a makeshift cane, a tree branch worn smooth by years of use. His clothing was layered, patched, the kind of assemblage that speaks of winters survived and summers endured. But it was what he pulled behind him that caught every eye in the courtroom. A shopping cart covered with a blue tarp, containing what appeared to be everything he owned. Eddie, as he would later tell the judge to call him, approached the defendant's podium with unexpected dignity. Despite his obvious poverty, despite the homelessness written in every layer of his clothing, he removed his worn baseball cap respectfully and stood as straight as his aged frame allowed. Judge Caprio looked up from his paperwork and immediately knew this wouldn't be a typical case. Something in the way this man carried himself, something in the protective way he kept one hand on that shopping cart, suggested depths that a simple shoplifting charge couldn't capture. "Mr. Sullivan," the judge began, his voice carrying its usual gentleness, "you're charged with shoplifting, specifically taking a loaf of bread from Murphy's corner store without paying. How do you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor." The voice that answered was quiet but clear, carrying the weight of someone who'd lived through things most people only read about. "I took the bread. I was hungry." Judge Caprio set down his pen, that familiar gesture that everyone in his courtroom recognized. Real conversation was about to begin. "Mr. Sullivan, can you tell me about your circumstances? Why were you unable to pay for the bread?" Eddie glanced around the packed gallery, then back at the judge. "Your Honor, I've been homeless for 8 years now. I live on the streets, try to find work when I can, but at my age—" He trailed off, the rest of the sentence hanging unspoken in the air. "May I ask your age?" 78, Your Honor." A pause. "Same as you, I believe." The courtroom went quiet. Judge Caprio sat back slightly, absorbing this information. 2 men, born in the same year, who had lived such vastly different lives. One honored and respected, sitting on the judicial bench. The other, homeless and hungry, standing before him as a defendant. "Indeed we are." Judge Caprio's voice softened further. "Mr. Sullivan, did you serve our country?" Eddie's posture straightened immediately, shoulders squaring despite the pain it obviously caused. "Yes, Your Honor. United States Army, Korea 1952 to 54. Then Vietnam 68 to 70, 2 tours. The judge stood up from his bench, his signature move when something touched him deeply. He walked around to the front, eliminating the formal barrier between bench and defendant. 2 wars, he said quietly. That's significant service, Eddie. Throughout this exchange, Judge Caprio had noticed something. Eddie never let go of his shopping cart. His grip on the handle remained constant, protective, as if guarding something infinitely precious. Eddie, the judge said carefully, I have to ask, what's in the cart? The change in Eddie was immediate. His entire body tensed, his grip tightening visibly on the cart handle. For the first time since entering, he looked genuinely distressed. Your Honor, it's personal items, nothing illegal. Just things that matter to me. Judge Caprio's intuition, honed by decades of reading people, told him they had arrived at the heart of something important. Eddie, would you be comfortable showing me what's in the cart? I'm not asking as a judge right now. I'm asking as a fellow human being who cares about your story. Eddie looked around the courtroom at the 40-plus people watching this exchange. His hands trembled slightly as he considered the request. Your Honor, people might think I'm crazy when they see what's in here. Eddie, I've been on this bench for 30 years. I've seen everything, and I've never thought anyone was crazy for caring about something deeply. Judge Caprio's voice carried absolute sincerity. Please show us. Eddie took a deep breath and, slowly, pulled back the blue tarp. What the courtroom saw made everyone collectively inhale. The shopping cart was filled with photographs, hundreds of them, carefully organized in plastic sleeves and folders. Interspersed among them were letters, military documents, dog tags, medals. A Purple Heart, campaign ribbons, what appeared to be a carefully maintained military journal. But it was the photographs that commanded attention. Black and white images from Korea, color photos from Vietnam, young faces, most barely past boyhood, looking at the camera with that particular mixture of bravery and uncertainty that defines soldiers heading into combat. Eddie, Judge Caprio said, his voice barely above a whisper. Are these? Yes, Your Honor, Eddie's voice cracked. Every soldier from my units who didn't make it home, Korea and Vietnam. I've been carrying their pictures and their stories for over 65 years. The courtroom fell into absolute silence, the kind of silence that feels sacred, that makes even breathing seem intrusive. Eddie began lifting out photographs one by one, handling each with the reverence usually reserved for holy relics. This is Private Tommy Chen from San Francisco, 19 years old when he died at Chosin Reservoir. Eddie's weathered fingers traced the edge of the photograph. He used to show me pictures of his little sister, talked about teaching her to drive when he got home. Judge Caprio moved closer, drawn by something larger than judicial curiosity. Eddie continued, pulling out more photographs. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez from El Paso. He was going to marry his high school sweetheart when we got back from Korea. Wrote her a letter every single day. His voice dropped. He died carrying 3 wounded men to safety. And this, Eddie said, his hands shaking now as he held up another photograph, is Lieutenant James Morrison from Maine, 22 years old. He saved my life in Vietnam by throwing himself on a grenade. Last thing he said to me was, "Tell my mom I died thinking about her apple pie." As Eddie continued sharing stories, people in the courtroom began to cry. Court officers who had maintained professional composure through thousands of cases found themselves wiping their eyes. Other defendants, moments before worried only about their own citations, sat transfixed by this unexpected memorial service. Your Honor, Eddie said quietly, I know people think I'm just a crazy old homeless man with a cart full of junk. But these boys, they deserve to be remembered. Their families deserve to know that someone still carries their memory. Judge Caprio's eyes glistened as the scope of Eddie's decades-long commitment became clear. Eddie, How many soldiers' stories are you carrying? 437, Your Honor. Every name, every face, every story I can remember. Eddie gestured to the cart. I've got their letters home, their medals, personal effects that their families never claimed. I've been their guardian for over 6 decades. But Eddie wasn't finished. He reached into the deepest part of his cart and pulled out a worn notebook, its edges frayed from decades of handling, its pages yellowed by time and weather and constant use. This is their book, Your Honor. Every story I could find, every detail about their lives and their deaths. I've been writing it for 65 years, adding to it whenever I learn something new about one of my boys. Judge Caprio took the notebook with reverent hands. As he began reading, his expression transformed from amazement to awe to something approaching reverence. The pages were filled with meticulous handwriting, dates, places, names, circumstances. But more than that, favorite songs, dreams for the future, last words, final letters home. It was the most comprehensive, loving memorial to forgotten heroes that Judge Caprio had ever encountered. Then he read something that made him stop completely. Eddie, it says here that you've been tracking down families of fallen soldiers and returning their personal effects. He looked up. How many families have you found? Over 200, Your Honor. Sometimes it takes years, but I find them eventually. I give them their son's last letter, or his medal, or a picture he carried. Eddie's voice strengthened slightly. I tell them how brave their boy was, how much he was loved by his brothers. Judge Caprio realized he was looking at a man who had spent 65 years serving others, honoring the dead, and comforting the living, all while living in poverty himself. Eddie, you've been homeless for 8 years? Yes, sir. Lost my apartment when my VA disability got cut due to some paperwork error. Been living on the streets since then. He glanced at the cart. But I keep the cart with me always. These boys need someone to watch over them. Judge Caprio stood there for a long moment, this notebook of remembrance in his hands, looking at a man who embodied everything he believed in. Service, sacrifice, dignity, the stubborn refusal to let the forgotten remain forgotten. Ladies and gentlemen, he finally said, addressing the entire courtroom, I want you to understand what we're witnessing here. Mr. Sullivan stands accused of stealing bread worth $2.49. But what he's actually been doing for 65 years is carrying out the most important work any of us can do. Keeping memory alive, honoring sacrifice, serving those who can no longer serve themselves. He looked directly at Eddie. Mr. Sullivan, this court finds you guilty of shoplifting. The law requires that finding. Eddie nodded, accepting this. However, Judge Caprio continued, his voice strengthening, this court also recognizes that you have paid for that loaf of bread many times over, through your service in 2 wars, through 65 years of selfless dedication to fallen heroes, through every cold night you've spent on the streets protecting their memory. He paused, letting his words settle. The fine for your offense would be $75. Instead, I'm not only waiving that fine completely, but I'm directing the court to provide you with assistance. My staff will help you navigate the VA system to restore your disability benefits. We'll connect you with housing services. And Eddie, I want you to know that your work, this memorial you've been carrying, it matters. It's extraordinary. The courtroom erupted in applause. Eddie stood there, tears streaming down his weathered face, overwhelmed by recognition he had never sought and perhaps felt he didn't deserve. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished. Furthermore, I'm going to personally contact the Rhode Island Veterans Museum and the Providence Historical Society. This collection you've maintained, this book you've written, it deserves to be preserved, shared, honored. Your boys deserve that. You deserve that. The video of Eddie's case went viral within days. Within a week, it had been viewed over 10 million times. The response was overwhelming. A GoFundMe campaign raised over $600,000 for Eddie's care and housing. The VA, embarrassed by the publicity, immediately restored his benefits and provided him with permanent supportive housing. The Rhode Island Veterans Museum created a special exhibit featuring Eddie's collection, with Eddie himself serving as the curator. But perhaps most importantly, dozens of families contacted Eddie. Families who had lost loved ones in Korea and Vietnam, who had spent decades wondering about their fathers' or brothers' or sons' final days. Eddie met with each one, shared stories, returned precious items, provided the closure that the military bureaucracy had failed to give them. Eddie Sullivan lived for 6 more years after that October morning in Judge Caprio's courtroom. He spent those years finally housed, finally secure, finally able to properly care for the memorial he had carried for so long. When he passed away in 2025, his funeral was attended by over 500 people, veterans, family members of fallen soldiers, and Judge Frank Caprio himself, who delivered a eulogy that left not a dry eye in the church. Eddie taught us, Judge Caprio said that day, that heroism isn't always about the moment of sacrifice. Sometimes it's about the decades of remembrance that follow. Sometimes it's about refusing to let the forgotten stay forgotten. Sometimes it's about carrying 437 names in a shopping cart because you made a promise to your brothers that you would never let them go. Eddie's collection now occupies a permanent place in the Rhode Island Veterans Museum. The notebook he maintained for 65 years has been digitized and made available to researchers and families. And on the wall beside the exhibit, there's a photograph of Eddie Sullivan standing next to Judge Frank Caprio. Both men smiling, both understanding that justice is not just about law. It's about recognizing the sacred in the everyday, the heroic in the humble, the extraordinary in what others dismiss as ordinary. Some people carry briefcases. Some carry burdens. Eddie Sullivan carried both, and in doing so carried 437 fallen soldiers home, one memory at a time.